There's a specific kind of pain no one talks about because, honestly, it sounds wrong when you say it out loud. Not lust, not obsession, not some fantasy you invented because you were lonely. I mean the kind of connection that feels disturbingly real. The kind where one conversation rearranges something inside you so quietly you don't even notice until weeks later, when your life suddenly feels divided into before her and after her. And the worst part? She belongs to someone else. Not emotionally unavailable, not it's complicated, married. You try to be rational about it at first. You tell yourself you're projecting, romanticizing, filling emotional gaps with imagination because that's easier than facing your own emptiness. But then she looks at you for half a second too long, and something in you recognizes something. If this video reaches you at the exact moment you needed someone to finally say the quiet part out loud, subscribe. Not because I'm trying to build an audience, but because some conversations are too honest to have only once. And men like you usually carry these thoughts alone for far too long. Because here's what nobody prepares you for. Sometimes the deepest emotional connection of your life arrives at the wrong time, in the wrong form, attached to the wrong reality. And that messes with a man psychologically more than he admits, especially men who spend most of their lives trying to stay emotionally controlled. You know what I've noticed? A lot of men can survive rejection. They can survive heartbreak, even betrayal. But ambiguity? Ambiguity destroys them quietly. Because at least rejection gives you an ending. At least betrayal gives you anger. But this? This gives you nothing solid, just fragments, eye contact, timing, conversations that felt too intimate for what they were supposed to be. And now your mind keeps replaying tiny moments like they're evidence in a trial no one else knows is happening. The way she understood something you never explained properly. The way she softened around you. The way she seemed emotionally present in a world where everyone else feels distracted and performative. You start asking yourself dangerous questions at night. Was it real? And underneath that question is the one you're actually afraid to ask. Did she feel it too? See, men rarely talk about emotional longing unless it becomes physical. That's why so many of them misunderstand what's happening to them here. They think they're addicted to attraction, but what they're really addicted to is recognition. Feeling seen can become intoxicating when you've spent years adapting yourself into someone useful instead of someone understood. That's why this kind of connection hits harder than casual desire ever could. Because desire excites you. Recognition destabilizes you. And the truly painful part? You probably met her during a season where you were already emotionally exhausted. Maybe disconnected from yourself. Maybe successful on paper but strangely numb in private. Maybe carrying around this low-grade loneliness you stopped trying to explain to people because nobody really got it. Then suddenly, there she is. And she speaks to the version of you that hasn't had oxygen in years. That's why men in this situation often feel ashamed of how deeply affected they are. They think, she's married. Why can't I just move on? But emotions don't obey morality in clean, cinematic ways. Good people can feel impossible things. Mature people can still become emotionally overwhelmed. And sometimes, the strongest connections enter your life specifically to expose the emotional truths you've been avoiding. Not to reward you, not to complete you, to reveal you. And I know that's uncomfortable to hear, because part of you still wants this story to end with certainty, with mutual confession, with fate stepping in dramatically at the last second. But real emotional tension rarely looks dramatic from the outside. Usually it looks like two people trying very hard to behave normally, while something unspoken keeps growing in the silence between them. And if you've experienced that, truly experienced it, then you already know this isn't just about her anymore. What makes this kind of connection so psychologically dangerous is that it doesn't enter your life loudly. It enters quietly. You're not planning to fall into it. In fact, most men in this situation spend the beginning trying not to feel anything at all. That's the irony. You probably respected her more because she was married. You kept boundaries. You monitored your tone. Maybe you even avoided certain conversations because some instinct inside you already sensed the emotional gravity forming underneath the surface. But emotions don't care about the agreements your mind made. And sometimes what pulls two people together isn't flirtation, it's familiarity. Not the comfortable kind, the haunting kind, the kind where someone says something ordinary and somehow it lands directly in the oldest wound you have. A lot of men watching this have spent years functioning emotionally like survival machines. Productive, responsible, adapted. You learned early that your value came from composure, performance, usefulness. So eventually you stopped expecting emotional intimacy from life altogether. You settled for stimulation instead. Entertainment, work, gym, achievement, distraction. Casual attention that never asked anything real from you. Then one woman comes along and suddenly your nervous system reacts like it's remembering something human. That's why this connection feels disproportionate. You're not just reacting to her, you're reacting to the part of yourself that woke up around her. And that distinction matters. Because if you don't understand it, you'll spend months, maybe years, convinced she was the only possible source of meaning in your life. She probably wasn't, but she may have been the first mirror that showed you how emotionally starved you'd become. There's another uncomfortable truth here most people avoid because it sounds too emotionally complicated for the internet. Sometimes soul-level attraction has very little to do with compatibility. I know men hate hearing that. Because when a connection feels profound, the brain immediately starts building a future around it. You start interpreting emotional intensity as evidence that you're supposed to be together. But emotional intensity can also come from unresolved longing, timing, projection, psychological familiarity, shared loneliness, mutual restraint. Sometimes two people connect deeply because they arrived in each other's lives carrying similar emotional absences. And absence recognizes absence instantly. That's why conversations with her probably felt unusually honest, almost disarming. Not because either of you planned it, because emotionally neglected people often feel safest around someone who notices what others overlook. You know what men rarely admit? The moments that affect them most are usually incredibly small. Not dramatic seduction, not cinematic declarations. Tiny things. The way she remembered a detail no one else remembered. The concern in her voice when you looked exhausted. The strange softness in certain silences. Those moments stay because men are often deprived of emotionally attentive energy for so long that when they finally receive it, it imprints deeply. Especially if they've been pretending they don't need it. And this is where things become psychologically complicated. Because now you're trapped between two realities. One reality says, she's married, respect the boundary, let it go. The other says, but what if this was real? And people underestimate how mentally exhausting that split becomes over time. You begin editing yourself constantly, monitoring every interaction, trying to appear calm while internally overanalyzing everything. Did she hold eye contact longer? Was that moment intentional? Why did that conversation feel emotionally intimate? Why does she seem different around me? You become hyper-aware because uncertainty creates obsession far more effectively than certainty ever could. The human mind can tolerate pain better than unfinished emotional stories. That's why you replay interactions at 2 a.m. like your brain is trying to solve a puzzle that has no clean answer. But here's the part I really need you to hear. Just because a connection is meaningful doesn't automatically mean it's meant to become a relationship. I know that sentence disappoints something inside you, but maturity is recognizing that not every emotionally profound connection is asking to be possessed. Some are asking to transform you instead. And honestly, that transformation usually begins the moment you stop asking, how do I get her? And start asking the far more uncomfortable question, why did this affect me so deeply in the first place? At some point, the story stops being about what's happening between you and her and starts becoming about what's happening inside you when she's not around. That's usually how you can tell it's no longer just attraction. It becomes mental occupation. You're at work and your focus drifts. You're with friends and you're half present. You're doing something important and suddenly, without warning, your mind pulls her into the frame like she belongs there. And you don't even resist it anymore. That's the subtle shift most men miss. Because you still tell yourself, I'm in control, I'm just thinking. But there's a difference between thinking about someone and being emotionally influenced by the thought of them. And if we were sitting across from each other right now, I wouldn't shame you for it. I'd ask you something simpler. What exactly are you missing when she appears in your mind? Not her specifically, not her personality, not her body, not even the idea of her life, but the feeling state she triggers in you. Because this is where psychology gets very honest very quickly. Most intense emotional attachments are not built on who someone is. They're built on who you become around them. Think about that carefully. Around her, maybe you felt more attentive, more awake, more intentional with your words. Maybe you noticed yourself becoming a better version of your own presence, calmer, more emotionally articulate, more alive. And then your mind did something very human. It confused activation with destiny. It assumed, if I feel more like myself around her, then she must be the source of that feeling. But what if she wasn't the source? What if she was just the trigger? There's a quiet pattern I've seen in men who experience this kind of emotional fixation. They aren't actually chasing the woman. They're chasing the version of themselves that temporarily appeared in her presence. And when she's gone, that version disappears too. So now the longing becomes double-layered. You miss her, and you miss you. That's why it doesn't fade easily. You can replace attraction. You can replace companionship. You can even replace chemistry over time. But it's harder to replace the feeling of becoming more emotionally alive, especially if your daily life doesn't offer much of that naturally. And here's where the married part makes everything sharper. Because her unavailability doesn't reduce the intensity, it amplifies it. Psychologically, the mind assigns higher emotional value to what cannot be completed. Not because it's better, but because it remains unresolved. So instead of closing the loop, your brain keeps it open, keeps returning, replaying, reconstructing meaning from fragments. And over time, the story starts to feel bigger than it actually is. Not fake, just inflated by repetition. And I want to say something carefully here, because this is where many men start to misinterpret their own emotions. Feeling deeply does not automatically mean you are meant for someone. Depth of feeling is not proof of direction. It's proof of impact. And impact can come from many places: timing, emotional readiness, loneliness, resonance, or simply meeting someone who temporarily fits the emotional shape you didn't realize you were carrying. There's also something else happening underneath all of this that men rarely articulate. It's not just desire, it's reverence mixed with frustration. Because she represents something you can't ethically pursue, but emotionally can't dismiss. That tension creates a kind of internal split. One part of you tries to remain grounded, respectful, rational. The other part keeps whispering, "But why did this feel so real?" And that question, if left unanswered, can quietly start reshaping your self-perception. You begin wondering if you missed something in your life, if you're late to something, if you're only now discovering what real connection feels like. And that's where emotional distortion can begin. Not because you're weak, but because your mind is trying to assign meaning to intensity without enough context to properly interpret it. So it builds a story. And the story always feels more coherent than the truth. There's a moment in this kind of experience that doesn't feel dramatic at all. It feels quiet, almost ordinary. But internally, it changes everything. It's when you realize you've started measuring other women against her. Not consciously at first. You don't announce it to yourself like some decision. It just happens in small comparisons your mind makes without asking permission. A conversation feels a little flatter than you expected, and you think of her. Someone smiles at you, but it doesn't land the same way. A moment of attention shows up, and somehow it feels less precise, less tuned, less awake than what you remember. And this is where things get psychologically tricky, because your brain is no longer responding to people directly. It's responding through a filter, a memory filter that has been emotionally amplified. And memory, especially emotional memory, is not neutral. It edits, it softens, it highlights meaning and removes friction. So what you're actually comparing isn't real life versus real life. It's real life versus a highly concentrated emotional imprint. And of course, reality starts to feel disappointing in comparison. But here's the part most men don't consider. What if the intensity you experienced wasn't sustainable in the first place? What if it wasn't meant to be replicated? There are certain human connections that feel so emotionally charged precisely because they exist in a very narrow window of time, context, and restraint. Remove any one of those variables, and the dynamic changes completely. That doesn't make it fake, it just makes it situational. But when you're inside it, it rarely feels situational. It feels personal. And that's why the mind struggles to let it stay in the past where it belongs. Because accepting it as situational forces you to face something harder. That not every profound emotional experience is asking to be continued. Some experiences are complete the moment they happen, even if they don't feel complete. There's also another layer here that quietly affects men more than they admit. It's the subtle erosion of emotional availability in your current life. When your mind is preoccupied with someone who is not available, you become less emotionally present with what is available. You might still function normally on the surface, but internally, you're partially elsewhere. And people around you can feel that absence even if they can't name it, especially in dating, especially in relationships where presence matters more than performance. And then a strange cycle begins. The more emotionally unavailable you become in your present life, the more your mind retreats into the emotionally charged memory that feels alive. It's not intentional, it's compensatory. Your mind is choosing intensity over neutrality because neutrality feels empty in comparison. But intensity that cannot be acted upon eventually turns inward. It becomes rumination. And rumination is where emotional experiences stop being experiences and start becoming loops. You replay moments not to feel them again, but to understand them, to extract meaning, to find proof that what you felt was valid, real, important. And this is where I want to slow down the narrative for a moment, because I need you to hear something clearly. Your emotions are valid. The impact you felt was real. But validation does not automatically equal direction. Just because something changed you doesn't mean it was meant to be pursued. And just because it feels unfinished doesn't mean it's incomplete in reality. Sometimes the mind refuses closure not because closure is unavailable, but because closure would force you to accept that the experience belongs to a category you didn't want it to belong to. A meaningful encounter that cannot continue. And I know that category feels uncomfortable. It feels like loss without resolution. But it's also where emotional maturity begins. Not when you stop feeling, but when you stop needing every feeling to turn into a story that continues forever. There's a specific kind of silence that follows this experience. Not the silence of no contact, the silence inside your own mind when you realize you're still thinking about her, but the intensity has changed shape. It's less sharp now, less urgent, but more persistent. Like something that stopped knocking on the door and just started living in the hallway. And this is usually where men assume they're getting over it. But what's actually happening is more subtle. The emotional peak is fading, and the narrative is taking over. Because when intensity drops, the mind tries to preserve meaning. So it shifts from feeling to interpretation. You stop reliving moments as emotional experiences and start analyzing them like evidence. You begin asking different questions now. Not, what did I feel? But, what did it mean? And that shift sounds mature on the surface, but it can actually keep you stuck longer. Because meaning has no natural endpoint. Feelings eventually settle, interpretations can loop indefinitely. And this is where men often create the most internal tension for themselves. They try to solve an emotional experience like it's a logical problem, as if, with enough reflection, enough replaying, enough understanding, it will finally resolve into certainty. But human connection doesn't behave like that, especially not the kind that forms under conditions of emotional timing, restraint, and unspoken recognition. There are simply too many variables, too many unknown internal states on both sides, and the mind hates that. So it fills in the gaps. It tells stories about mutual understanding, about unspoken depth, about something real that couldn't be expressed. And sometimes those stories are partially true, but partial truth can still become emotional distortion if it replaces grounded reality. I want to be careful here because I'm not dismissing what you felt. I'm describing how the mind naturally amplifies unresolved emotional experiences when they don't have a clean place to land. And there's another layer most men don't consciously notice. It's the quiet shift in identity that happens underneath all of this. At some point, she stops being just a person you met and starts becoming a symbol of connection you didn't expect, a symbol of emotional depth you didn't think you were capable of, a symbol of a life state you only accessed briefly. And once someone becomes a symbol, they become harder to release. Because now letting go doesn't feel like moving on from a person. It feels like abandoning a version of yourself. That's why advice like, just forget her, never works here. Because nothing about this is simple memory management. It's identity-level emotional imprinting. And this is also where men start to feel a quiet frustration with themselves. Not because they're still attached, but because they can't reconcile their emotional reality with their rational one. Rationally, you know the situation is not available. Rationally, you know the boundaries. But emotionally, your system is still responding to the impact. And that mismatch creates internal friction. You start judging yourself for it. You should be past this. You're overthinking. This shouldn't affect you anymore. But that self-judgment rarely speeds up healing. It usually just adds shame on top of longing. And shame doesn't resolve attachment. It deepens isolation. What actually begins to loosen this kind of grip is not suppression and not obsession either, but honest recontextualization. Seeing the experience for what it was, without inflating it into fate or reducing it into fantasy, just acknowledging it as a real emotional event that had a beginning, a peak, and a natural boundary you didn't choose but still have to respect. And I know that sounds simple when I say it like that, but emotionally, it's one of the hardest things a person can do, because it requires you to hold two truths at the same time. It mattered to me, and it still doesn't belong to me. And most people spend a long time trying to choose only one of those truths, instead of learning to carry both. There comes a point where you stop asking the question out loud. But it doesn't mean it's gone. It just goes inward. What if? Not as a fantasy anymore, not even as hope, more like a reflex your mind runs when it gets quiet. What if the timing was different? What if you met earlier? What if life had arranged itself another way? And I want to be very honest with you here, in a way that doesn't try to soften the edges too much. That line of thinking feels meaningful because it's emotionally charged. But it's also the place where men can stay stuck the longest. Not because they're still in love in a simple sense, but because they're still negotiating with reality and their imagination. And imagination is always generous. Reality is not. Reality includes everything you don't see in the moment, the life she chose, the commitments she carries, the emotional structure already built around her world. And your life too. The version of you that existed before her. The responsibilities you were already holding, the path you were already walking, even if it felt quieter than what you experienced with her. Here's something most men don't like hearing at first. Sometimes a person doesn't come into your life to become your future. They come in to reveal the emotional gap you've been living with, not to exploit it, not to harm you, just to show it. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. That's why it lingers. But here's where the real turning point quietly happens. Not in dramatic closure, not in confrontation, not in some final conversation. But in the moment you stop using that connection as the standard for emotional life. When you stop comparing everything to it. When you stop revisiting it to feel something again. When it becomes part of your story, instead of the place you keep returning to live emotionally. And I need you to understand something carefully. Letting go doesn't mean erasing what you felt. It means relocating it from the present to the past. From something you are actively inside of to something that shaped you. And there is a difference. Because what shaped you can still matter. It can still have weight, still have truth, still have emotional depth. But it doesn't need to be the place you live anymore. And if I'm speaking to you directly right now, I don't want you to leave this thinking the goal was to win her in your mind, or to outgrow your feelings by force, or to prove to yourself that it didn't matter. That would be a misunderstanding of everything we just went through together. The real shift is quieter than that. It's when your nervous system slowly stops treating the memory like a present tense event. When your mind stops scanning for meaning every time it gets quiet. When your emotional world starts making room again for new connections that aren't filtered through comparison. And yes, that can feel empty at first, because intensity leaves a kind of echo, but that echo is not a destination. It's a transition. And one day, without you forcing it, you'll notice something subtle. You'll think of her, and it won't open a door inside you anymore. It will just pass through. No pull, no spiral, no negotiation with reality, just recognition, and then release. Not because she became less important, but because you finally returned to yourself.